For years, the rumors circled like vultures around his name, feeding on silence, growing louder each time he chose to rise above them rather than respond. People speculated, debated, invented their own versions of the truth, convinced that where there was smoke, there had to be fire. And through it all, he remained quiet. Not because the whispers didn't hurt, not because the accusations didn't pierce him, but because he believed protecting the sanctity of his home mattered more than satisfying the curiosity of strangers. What no one knew was the emotional weight behind that silence. Every rumor, every headline, every sideways comment added a new crack to a heart already burdened by years of personal struggle. Every time he stood in front of thousands to preach hope, he carried the ache of knowing entire crowds were analyzing his every word, searching for signs of weakness, waiting for confirmation of stories he never asked to be part of. Behind the polished sermons and the commanding presence was a man wrestling with the pain of watching his private life become public property. He saw how speculation wounded the people he loved, how it created distance, how it turned small misunderstandings into dramatic narratives far removed from reality. And yet, he stayed silent, not because he was hiding guilt, but because he was protecting two lives, his own and the woman who had stood beside him through seasons few people knew existed. He stayed silent because he believed love deserved privacy. He stayed silent because he knew once words left his mouth, the world would twist them into something he couldn't control. But silence, no matter how noble, has a weight of its own. It wasn't until the emotional strain threatened to fracture everything that he realized silence had become a prison. The weight on his shoulders grew heavier each year, turning into something he could no longer ignore. The sleepless nights, the long drives alone, the unspoken fears, these became daily companions. And with every rumor that spread, every assumption thrown onto his back, he felt the truth inside him fighting to break free, not for revenge, not for vindication, but for healing, for peace, for the opportunity to reclaim the narrative of his own life before it shattered into pieces he could never gather again. So when he finally stood before his congregation, when he finally let his voice tremble through the microphone, it wasn't the voice of a man defending himself. It was the voice of a man who had carried the weight of others' assumptions for far too long, a man finally choosing truth, not to answer allegations, but to free himself from the silence that had nearly destroyed him. It happened in a moment so ordinary that no one realized its significance until much later. He was preparing backstage, adjusting his robe, reviewing his notes, doing what he had done thousands of times before. But that night, someone close to him captured a brief moment on camera. A moment that revealed a truth he had kept buried beneath years of discipline, charisma, and ministry strength. He didn't know he was being watched. He didn't know the camera was on. And in that tiny window of unguarded honesty, his entire posture shifted. His shoulders slumped, his hand pressed against his forehead, and his eyes, normally so sharp, so confident, so assured, carried the weight of a man fighting a storm no one else could see. It was the look of someone who had been holding his breath for too long, the look of someone breaking quietly behind the scenes while appearing strong in front of thousands. The rumors about his marriage had grown beyond whispers. They had grown into loud questions, constant speculation, and emotional noise that followed him everywhere he went. Every interview request felt like a trap. Every sermon felt like a battlefield. Every interaction required him to wear an armor he could barely lift anymore. And the moment caught on camera didn't show a man preparing to preach. It showed a man bracing himself to walk into a sanctuary filled with eyes searching for answers he was not ready to give. As he sat down in that backstage chair, unaware that the clip would eventually circulate among leaders close to him, he whispered something to himself, a whisper that would later shake those who heard it. "I don't know how much longer I can carry this." Those words were not a complaint, they were a confession of the pressure that had built up as the world demanded explanations, confirmations, denials, statements. When his heart wasn't ready for any of it, he wasn't just reacting to rumors, he was reacting to years of emotional strain, years of being expected to be perfect, years of protecting a relationship that had been dragged into public conversation without his consent. Those who saw the clip realized something the public never understood. The allegations weren't the real wound, the weight of assumptions was. This wasn't about scandal. It wasn't about moral failure. It was about the crushing pressure of living under a microscope, where every smile, every pause, every sermon, every gesture became evidence in a narrative he never wrote. And as he walked onto the stage that night, the world saw a bishop delivering a message. But the few who had witnessed his private moment backstage saw the truth. They saw a husband trying to protect his marriage, a leader trying to protect his dignity, and a man trying to protect his heart from breaking under the weight of rumors that refused to die. That single captured moment, raw, unguarded, painful, became the turning point. It showed that this wasn't about confirmation of allegations. It was about confronting the emotional storm that the rumors had created. It was a glimpse into the quiet suffering behind the silence, a suffering that would eventually drive him to finally speak. What the world never saw, what even those closest to him rarely witnessed, was the battle he fought inside long before he ever opened his mouth to address the growing noise around his marriage. While people debated, speculated, and confidently repeated things they had never confirmed, he was living through a quiet war between his public responsibilities and his private heartbreak. He carried himself with dignity, but inside, the pressure had begun to fracture him. Nights that should have been restful became long hours of staring at the ceiling, wondering how a man called to guide thousands could feel so lost in his own home. Days that once flowed with purpose now felt heavy, as if every step required more strength than the last. And through all of it, he kept moving, not because he was unaffected, but because that was what was expected of him. Leaders had to be strong, husbands had to be composed, public figures had to be unbothered, so he played the role the world demanded, even when his heart felt like it was splintering under the weight of unanswered questions and unspoken pain. But the emotional collapse didn't come suddenly. It built slowly, quietly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. It began with small moments, forgetting a line in a sermon, losing focus during staff meetings, withdrawing from conversations he once enjoyed. His laughter became strained, his smiles became thinner, and sometimes, in the middle of preaching, he would feel a wave of sadness wash over him so unexpected he had to grip the pulpit to steady himself. People saw a powerful message. They didn't see the trembling hands hidden behind the podium. They didn't see the tightness in his chest as memories, misunderstandings, and unresolved tensions flooded his thoughts. They didn't see the spiritual leader silently battling emotional exhaustion while trying to hold a ministry and a relationship together. At home, the pressure was even heavier. Every rumor felt like an unwelcome guest knocking on his door. Every headline felt like a shadow creeping into spaces that should have been sacred. He tried to shield his partner from the noise, but the more he protected, the more isolated he became. The love between them hadn't died, but it had been suffocated under layers of public scrutiny, private disagreements, unrealistic expectations, and emotional fatigue. And with each passing month, the unresolved tension grew sharper until he could feel it in his bones. So when he finally reached the moment of confession, when he finally allowed himself to speak the truth he had buried, it wasn't the result of a scandal breaking open. It was the result of a heart breaking open, a heart that could no longer carry the silence, a heart that needed release more than it needed reputation. And in that confession, he revealed not betrayal, not shame, but the simple human truth that love, ministry, and life become unbearably heavy when carried alone. When the people closest to him finally gathered the courage to speak openly, what they revealed was not the explosive scandal the world had imagined, but a heartbreaking tapestry of misunderstandings, missed signals, and emotional strain that had been building for years. These were individuals who had watched him up close, not the bishop on stage, but the man behind closed doors. They had seen the exhaustion in his eyes, the long pauses before he answered simple questions, the way he sometimes drifted into silence during meetings, as if his thoughts were somewhere miles away. They knew something was wrong long before the public caught wind of it, but they didn't know how deeply the cracks had spread until the tension reached a breaking point. When they finally opened up about what they had witnessed, the truth poured out like water breaking through a dam. They described moments where he would sit alone in his office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at the floor with a heaviness that seemed to swallow the room. They recalled nights when he finished preaching with fire and power only to retreat backstage and fold into himself, wiping tears before anyone could enter. They remembered times when he canceled private meetings because he needed a moment, moments that became more frequent as the pressure around his marriage intensified. To outsiders, he looked strong. To those who truly knew him, he looked like a man being quietly crushed under expectations he could no longer meet. And then there were the misunderstandings, small at first, then magnified by distance, stress, and the unrelenting gaze of the public. Loved ones explained how innocent disagreements became fuel for rumors, how the smallest change in body language during public events was twisted into narratives that had nothing to do with reality, how every decision, from travel schedules to sermon topics, became misinterpreted as signs of trouble. They spoke of seeing him struggle to juggle two worlds, the world that demanded he be a spiritual giant, and the private world where he was simply a man trying to keep his marriage intact amid overwhelming pressure. Those closest to him also shared how the atmosphere around him changed as the allegations grew louder. Friends became cautious, staff members walked on eggshells, Conversations became shorter, more formal, less personal. The emotional distance created by public scrutiny seeped into private relationships, leaving him surrounded by people yet profoundly alone. And in that loneliness, misunderstandings between him and his spouse became deeper, more painful, harder to repair. Their testimonies revealed a truth the public never considered. The situation was not born from betrayal but from burnout. Not from lies, but from lack of communication. Not from scandal, but from the slow erosion of emotional connection under the unrelenting weight of ministry and fame. Those who knew him best didn't confirm wrongdoing. They confirmed humanity. They confirmed heartbreak. They confirmed the toll that years of pressure had taken on a man who had spent his life giving strength to others while slowly losing his own. What came next was the moment that changed everything. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was finally honest. After years of holding the world together with his voice, his sermons, his leadership, and his unshakable presence, he reached a point where he could no longer pretend that everything behind the scenes was fine. The truth was much simpler and far more painful. He was tired. Not physically tired, but emotionally drained in a way that made breathing feel heavy and decisions feel impossible. And, for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to speak from that place of exhaustion. When he opened up to those closest to him, his words were not polished or rehearsed. They spilled out like a confession, raw and trembling, revealing the heavy truth he had kept locked inside, that the pressure of ministry, the spotlight of fame, and the constant noise surrounding his marriage had taken a toll he could no longer ignore. He admitted that he had tried to be everything for everyone, the strong leader, the comforting pastor, the public figure with answers to every question, while quietly losing pieces of himself in the process. He shared how difficult it had been to navigate a relationship under the scrutiny of millions, how every disagreement felt amplified by public expectations, and how every reconciliation was overshadowed by rumors swirling outside the walls of his home. He wasn't pointing blame, he wasn't defending himself. He was simply acknowledging what no one had ever allowed him to say, that love becomes complicated when the world insists on watching it like a show. He spoke about the pressure to please people, the fear of disappointing his congregation, the guilt of not being able to balance ministry and marriage as perfectly as others imagined he should. And as he spoke, those listening didn't hear a man making excuses. They heard a man finally telling the truth. He confessed how often he had wanted to speak earlier, to clarify misunderstandings and silence the rumors, but every time he almost did, he stopped himself, not because he had something to hide, but because he was terrified of making things worse, terrified of exposing his partner to more pain, terrified of giving the world pieces of his heart that he wasn't sure it would handle with care. He admitted that the silence people misinterpreted as guilt was actually the silence of a man trying to protect what little peace he had left. And as the truth poured out of him, something unexpected happened. The weight began to lift. Those who heard him didn't judge him. They felt compassion for him. They realized that behind the headlines, behind the speculation, behind the allegations, there was a human being fighting for balance, clarity, and emotional survival. His revelation wasn't a scandalous confession, it was a deeply human one. He wasn't confirming wrongdoing. He was confirming struggle. He was confirming that marriage is fragile under pressure. He was confirming that pastors are human. He was confirming that sometimes love doesn't break. It simply bends under the weight of life. And in that vulnerable moment, he finally allowed himself to stop pretending he was unshakable. He allowed himself to be real. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, the relief of finally being understood. When he finally spoke publicly, the world braced for scandal. But what they heard instead was something far more surprising, far more sobering, and far more human than anything they had imagined. His voice didn't carry the defensive tone people expected from a man under scrutiny. It carried something deeper, something weary, something honest. As he stepped onto the stage, the sanctuary fell silent, not out of curiosity, but because everyone sensed this was not just another sermon. This was a man preparing to open a door he had kept locked for far too long. And when he began, he didn't start with blame, denial, or justification. He started with truth, the kind of truth that trembles as it leaves your lips, because you know, once it's spoken, nothing can ever be the same again. He admitted the emotional toll of living under a microscope, the strain of balancing love and leadership, and the pain of watching private challenges twisted into public narratives that never reflected the whole story. What struck people most was not what he revealed, but how he revealed it. There was no bitterness, no anger, no attempt to shift accountability. Instead, he spoke like a man who had been carrying a wound in his chest for years, finally allowing fresh air to touch it. He acknowledged moments of misunderstanding in his marriage, moments of emotional exhaustion, moments where he fell silent because he was simply overwhelmed. But he also spoke about love, real love, the kind that survives storms, the kind that evolves, the kind that hurts and heals and stretches and reshapes you. He didn't confirm scandalous accusations. He confirmed that relationships are complicated, especially under pressure. He confirmed that assumptions often grow louder than truth. And he confirmed that even the strongest leaders suffer in silence when the world expects them to be unbreakable. As he continued, the congregation wasn't listening to a bishop anymore. They were listening to a man admitting he had been afraid, a man admitting that silence had become a shield, a man admitting that the weight of public expectation had nearly crushed him. And when he reached the heart of his message, something shifted in the room. The people who expected drama were met with vulnerability. The people who expected confession were met with clarity. The people who expected confirmation of wrongdoing were met with the revelation that the real battle had been emotional, not scandalous. And then came the moment that left everyone breathless. He said, "Sometimes the truth isn't what people assume. Sometimes the truth is simply that love has seasons, hard seasons, quiet seasons, healing seasons, and we walked through all of them under a spotlight that gave us no place to rest." Those words hit harder than any confirmation of rumor ever could, because in that sentence, he revealed the real story, not a scandal, but a journey, not betrayal, but burden, not collapse, but growth. When he finished, there was no applause, only a deep, reverent silence, the kind of silence that comes when truth finally replaces noise. And in that stillness, the world realized this was never about allegations or accusations. It was about a man reclaiming his narrative with grace, courage, and honesty. It was about letting the world see the human behind the title, the husband behind the bishop, the heart behind the headlines. And in that moment, everything changed, not because he confirmed what people expected, but because he revealed what they never understood. In the end, what emerged was not the explosive scandal people spent years hunting for, but a quiet, heartbreaking truth that only a man who had carried the weight of love, leadership, and public expectation could reveal. His confession was not a fall from grace, it was a return to it. When he spoke openly, he didn't clear his name to satisfy the crowd. He opened his heart to free himself from a silence that had grown too heavy to bear. The world finally saw what had been hidden beneath the surface all along, not deception, but exhaustion, not secrecy, but protection, not wrongdoing, but the complicated, human reality of trying to hold a marriage together under relentless scrutiny. And as his final words echoed across the sanctuary, something remarkable happened. The noise stopped, the rumors quieted, the assumptions dissolved. People looked at him not as a headline but as a man who loved deeply, struggled privately, and survived a storm that could have destroyed anyone else. The truth he shared did not divide the church, it healed it. It reminded everyone that leaders are human, that marriages endure seasons of both shadow and light, and that the strength to speak honestly is far more powerful than the strength to remain silent. When he stepped away from the podium, he wasn't lighter because the world finally knew the details. He was lighter because he finally told the truth that belonged to him, a truth that was never about scandal, but about survival, a truth that revealed not the end of something broken, but the beginning of something restored. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, he walked away not as a man haunted by allegations, but as a man finally at peace with his own story.